So today we are joined by Ioan Grillo, author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, and Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America. His newest book, Blood Gun Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels, is a look at how the illegal gun and drug trades are intertwined, how existing U.S. gun law results in firearms making their way into the black market in Mexico and around the world, including into the hands of Mexican drug cartels, and how they contribute to never-ending gun homicides. So it's awesome having you here, Yoan. We've been corresponding for a couple years now, and like your books have really been central to sort of how I've been able to wrap my mind around a lot of the drug war on the ground stuff in Mexico.
Thanks so much. Great to be here, Brian. Good to see you all there in your face on video.
Yeah, totally. And so I'm also joined by Dave Nichols
Hey, hey.
and Russell Hausfeld. So yeah, I mean, before we get into the book, how did you come to? So you grew up in England. How did you come to start covering the narco violence in Mexico, and how did that eventually lead you to covering this book on gun trafficking?
Yeah, sure. So I flew to Mexico for the first time in the year 2000 when I was 27 years old, and I wanted to start working as a journalist. I'd been basically messing around till then, and wanted to get into to foreign journalism, international journalism. And a route back then was still to fly to a country to start working in an English language newspaper, and then from there get into to kind of covering stories and stuff. Now I'd lived in Spain for a year. I'd also traveled around the Middle East, I'd been in various things. So I spoke some Spanish, and I was fascinated by Latin America. I hadn't been there before, and initially wasn't thinking about the drug cartel issue so much. I was kind of interested before in more the kind of stories of the 20th century of left-wing revolutions and the civil wars in Central America, and that kind of thing was kind of in my mind. And when I got to Mexico, very quickly I realized that that wasn't really the story that was happening, and that drugs and drug cartels and crime was a massive issue. I fell into it right away. Now, I also related this right away to my own growing up, because I grew up in England, just near the city of Brighton, in a community with a lot of drugs around back in the 1980s. A big feature that I grew up through was a lot of drug use, and a lot of kind of an opioid epidemic in my area. And I knew various people who died of heroin overdoses when I was a teenager, and kind of been around a lot of drugs. I worked in Ibiza for the nightclubs there, so I related right away the kind of drug trade, and kind of linking what I saw in Latin America to what we see in Europe, whatever. And I just very, very quickly started falling into this in the early 2000s as things were heating up. And then later on, when we got to 2008, was when things started really erupting. So I'd already by that time been in Mexico 8 years, already been covering quite a lot. And that was when I really started covering very heavily the erupting violence and the real intensity of the war since then.
So just to throw out there, I mean, one of the things I've really appreciated about your books in general is sort of the international lens. And it sounds like that was almost sort of built into your approach where, I mean, and also the systemic critiques that, as you sort of run through, like encountering people who say, oh, well, some of this violence is a result of the music that's popular in this area. And then sort of commenting, yeah, I don't really buy that music affects behavior those ways or similar things. Like, it sounds like landing on the ground in Mexico, you were already making connections back to where you were coming from, the things that you'd seen, sort of linking these systemic features. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. I always, my mind, I'm always like inquiring and trying to figure out big picture stuff, and trying to kind of make sense of things in big picture. Now, I think that can be good and bad. I think sometimes when we do that as people, we can come up with bad ideas about stuff.
Sure.
we kind of make theories about things that don't really stand up. But a lot of the coverage, is quite straightforward, covering this, that, and this. The Mexican coverage, and there's been some great, fantastic Mexican journalism for many, many years, tends to have certain different angles. And I don't say that either one is necessarily better or worse. You can come to problems with different angles. I think, a lot of Mexican reportage is very, very interested in the corruption, very interested in understanding very concretely the corruption and what's happening. And there's some, great exposés, and people who have fled the country because of these kind of exposés or been murdered because of them. They're very important to cover. But sometimes for me, coming to this story and then trying to tell this story, trying to make sense of it, and then tell this to, people back home. I grew up around a lot of people telling stories, very, very good storytellers. If it was some people sitting around parks, smoking, or in pubs drinking, it was often the kind of verbal culture of storytelling. And so sometimes for me, it's like, how do I get back and tell these stories in that same way to these people that understand this and describe these things? So that's something to be easy to bring to somebody in the United States or in Canada or in Japan. My first book got translated to Japanese and Polish and different languages, and the world has been very fascinated by this, but it is a very far out alien kind of thing. But it also, trying to make sense of the bigger picture and trying also to look for solutions. Now that again can be different, and one gets weary, and I do feel more weary now, and less, in some ways, less optimistic and less naive than when I wrote my first book 10 years ago. I kind of hoped then, kind of had then the kind of mentality, these are problems that can be solved. And, whereas people often, when I interview people living in these circumstances, living right in the midst of this, and I'm talking about often the hitmen themselves, gang members themselves, but who grow up immersed in this kind of stuff, they don't see with this kind of optimistic ideas of, these are problems, we find solutions. They see, this is the way it is. I've got to make the best of it I can. I've got to make a bit of cash out of this. I've got to survive for a bit, maybe live well for a bit, and then, whatever. They're not figuring out and thinking, how society can can solve these problems, the way that the people who are looking into it can do.
Totally. Well, and looking at some of these systemic issues that are so big, it's like offering that critical analysis and being able to say, here's how it's functioning. These are the different sort of influences and leverage points that are all intersecting with each other and creating systems where, here are the ways that people eke out a living within global capitalism. It's both like abstract and illuminating. And the way that you it strikes me as a sort of anthropological approach, right? Where you give these case studies, you give really richly detailed, stories, as you say, of what it looks like on the ground. And I know Normie wanted to talk about like the way you open your book with the Chapo trial and the way that you sort of all of a sudden you're just dropped in media res, into this scene of the guns being displayed and the fact that the guns aren't even the biggest issue. The fact that in fact, there's no real mechanism for holding him to account for the guns when you look at federal legislation, right?
Yeah. You said anthropologist. It's funny, my dad is an anthropologist, and I, as a teenager, I would say rejected academia. I rejected it at that time, as I was a teenager into punk rock and various things, and saw this kind of academic thinking as being this out of touch intellectualizing over the world, and nothing to do with kind of real people or the working class, or the kind of things that things that I would look at then, or I see in punk rock music. But I think a lot of my dad's anthropological ideas did get into me. However much I tried to reject them, they got into me.
Sure.
I saw journalism as being a bit more street than academia, because at least the journalists on the street talking to people and kind of stuff. But yeah, I think I do kind of look at some of these things and maybe have a certain anthropological look about those things. But I think, yeah, talking about the systemic or the mechanisms, I think it's like, I think partly about institutions. And I think when you look at, say, the Wire series, I think that's very good at showing these people acting within these institutions, whether they be the institution of the Baltimore Police Department or the institution of the drug trafficking organizations, drug selling organizations in the city. They're acting and playing and interacting with these. And I see that a lot with cartel operatives. On one side, these are human beings with their own, I always try and give people's life stories, and they've got their own, all of us have got our own life story. We're all born and grow up and have our own thing, but also existing within some kind of thing with bosses or power factors and these kind of things. So people operating with this, I think, to understand the level of violence and the cruelty, you need to understand the fact of institutions committing violence as opposed to individuals committing violence. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between if I'm just a guy in a pub and somebody looks at me funny, or somebody else, I look at somebody else funny, and he says, I'm going to smash a glass over your face, and it's just about an individual thing of pride and so forth, as opposed to when you're in a cartel hit squad, it might be a commander, but you're told, go into a town, take control of that town, get rid of the other cartel, and how you commit violence and terror in that kind of context.
Totally. And looking at some of the kids that get pulled off the street, which is something we wanted to talk about a little later as far as those systemic drivers. But, I know we wanted to flesh out some of throughout the book, you talk about the Iron River to sort of represent the flow of gunmetal from the U.S. in large part. We also touch a little bit on guns coming in from Europe, and there's some interesting stuff there. But when you flesh out this sort of concept of the Iron River and all of these flows of weapons, the fact that, as in the Chapo trial, where you highlight the fact that there's no specific law against gun running, which I know for me was like a jaw-dropping moment when I was reading it and just came across that. What was that like for you to experience on the ground as you were starting to dig into some of this stuff?
Yeah, I found that pretty mind-boggling as well.
Yeah, I mean, so this issue of firearms trafficking and the firearms market had been on my mind for a lot of years. I'd read many years ago the book called The Arms Bazaar about big arms trafficking. And that was a book from the 1970s, I think, original early 1980s. And I hadn't had that in my mind. And so I kind of thought about the gun trade and did stories as far back as 2004. I think I did a story on guns coming from the US into Mexico and interviewed people with illegal guns in Mexico then. For a long time, I didn't do it, partly because I thought the US Second Amendment was so powerful, that the gun culture and gun lobby was so strong. It was something we couldn't simply get into. But then in 2017, I interviewed a guy who's in the book, who's a firearms trafficker. I interviewed him in prison in Ciudad Juarez. And he explained the modus operandi to me of driving over the border from Chihuahua, Mexico, into Dallas urban area, going to gun shows, buying 10 to 14 gun shows every weekend with no paperwork whatsoever. And then it started really perking my interest about the mechanics of all this. And actually, I realized as I got into it, there's loads to discover. It's not as simple as America's got a Second Amendment and that's it. There's actually a whole bunch of issues. American gun laws, you realize as you get into it, they're not as simple as, there's a Second Amendment. There's a whole bunch of weird mosaic of stuff. There's a whole debate and discussion and fighting over the Second Amendment. There's the 1934 Firearms Act. There's a 1968 Gun Control Act, 1986. All of these different things happening and different forces happening. And then I was tried to focus on looking at the illegal gun markets. I'm looking at criminals, not at legal people having guns. But then you get into these weird things. You realize that this is all connected because they said that, and I realized when they said there's no firearms trafficking law, no federal firearms trafficking law, that was interesting. And how it's very, very different from drugs, then also very, very connected to drugs. So to understand the illegal firearms trafficking market, both in the United States and across the Americas, and how this work plays out, we have to also understand the drug trade is linked. Another thing that I came into was that, and I think which has been a big theme of all three books I've done, is this issue issue of these weird hybrid armed conflicts we find in Mexico and across Latin America. You've then got the issue of gun violence in the United States, in small islands of the United States that have a similar level of gun violence. But how to understand these weird hybrid armed conflicts there, and how that the gun trafficking from the United States is trafficking to this weird hybrid armed conflict. So before I had a kind of separation of the idea of just domestic gun violence, domestic gun selling, and an international arms trafficking. Two different things. We realize today these things are all entwined together, which makes it a very, very challenging thing to get into. And also, it's a very interesting to discover there isn't as much about this. However, the important issue has been there's been a lot of writing about guns, but actually writing about the gun black market, the firearm black market. And part of what I'm really interested in is how black markets work, how they operate, how these things, function, and how we should deal with them.
Yeah, that's one thing for me when I think about just the whole gun debate. It's so difficult for me to wrap my mind around. You have people talking about universal background checks. What does that actually mean? You're talking about just so over the 20th century. There's these various pieces of federal legislation. One of the holes that is in that legislation that some primary things in your book is the so-called gun show loophole, the private sale exemption. Can you talk a little bit about how that loophole functions and sort of how that applies to both private sales and gun shows, and how is that one of the main sources for guns getting out into the streets and into the hands of Mexican cartels?
Yeah, sure. So with guns, gun legislation, you find these, fascinating things. So you get back to the 1968 Gun Control Act. So the GCA, as they call it. So before then, there was, there wasn't this idea that people who were felons couldn't have firearms, or people who are mentally ill couldn't have firearms. So again, you get to a discussion about the Second Amendment. Does the Second Amendment, if it's a God-given right, as Second Amendment defenders and advocates, some of them will say, then does that mean somebody, if they've committed a felony, why should they not be allowed a gun? So you get these kind of debates. But after 1968, when you had rising gun violence in US cities, and you had these high-profile assassinations, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., you also had, interestingly, the Black Panthers going to Sacramento state legislature. So then, it was interesting. They helped provoke both the Gun Control Act and, in turn, the modern gun rights movement. Was the Black Panthers.
And from Reagan, no less, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Reagan plays an interesting role because Reagan is in favor of the Gun Control Act, and then so you have the Gun Control Act that happens in 1968, and they specify that people with felonies could not have guns. You fill out this form, the 4473, the federal form FF73, and people fill out this form to buy firearms and say, I'm not I don't have a felony, I don't use drugs. It's another thing that till today people have. I don't have mental illness and so forth. I haven't been convicted of domestic violence. Now, then you also have, in response to that, and that's then the ATF, the modern ATF, and its kind of form is created, first inside the Treasury, then it moves into the Justice Department. And then you have, in response to this, and in response to the gun violence as well, the radicalization of the NRA. So the NRA, going all the way back, is a kind of moderate group to train people in shooting. One of the original founders was worked at the New York Times. There were Civil War veterans from the North, and then they support the 1934 Act, they support the 1968 Act, and then in the 70s under this guy called Harlan Carter, who in a famous story shot dead a Mexican 15-year-old teenager when he was 17 years old in the border city of Laredo. Under him, there's much more radicalization of people saying we need guns to defend ourselves against crime, against mugging. Any gun regulation is a slippery slope down to come and take away our guns. and it's kind of fighting back. And then you get the 1980 under Reagan, who then adopts this new, more radicalized NRA position. Even
and he after he gets shot, right?
After he gets shot, and he survives the shooting. And there's the craziest back, all this stuff is crazy. So many crazy backstories around all this gun stuff. The guy who shot him was obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver, and obsessed by Jodie Foster. So that whole backstory there was kind of crazy. But despite him being shot, doesn't want to, and then has a 1986 act knocking back and kind of hitting the ATF. Then Clinton comes in and the background checks come in. Now, when the background checks come in, they do not apply to collectors. So the idea is, now it's very, very hard for them to bring in the instant background checks. It's a lot of, and to bring in the assault rifle ban as well. I mean, there's a huge amount of back and forth. So they say we're not going to apply them to a private collector, meaning like anything. If I'm a private collector, I've got a bunch of books behind me. I want to sell you a book. I don't have to get a license. I'm just selling you a book from my collection. We can just, I've got a bunch of records. I can go to a record fair and sell a few of my old records and trade. And we're not official sellers. So the same with guns. So I'm just a regular guy. I don't need to ask you for a background check if I'm just a regular guy selling you an old gun I've got. The problem is that then people abuse this and sell a lot of weapons to people who they know cannot pass the background check. So people who are criminals. Now, I saw this with my own eyes, in a gun show in Mesquite, which is in the Dallas urban area, place with a lot of gun shows. As Breitbart News called it, the gun show capital of America. And the ATF have records of this. So basically, the thing is, if you're an American citizen, you can go to shops, buy a bunch of guns, or go to distributors, buy a bunch of guns. Like people who can sell them, buy them in bulk. Go to a gun show, have a bunch of guns, just the regular collector and private seller. And then people who can find you, and this is what the Mexican trafficker I interviewed did, would find people who wouldn't ask for ID. And they're selling them for a markup. Now, we know this is happening. There's one case I look at of a guy, a Vietnam vet, doing this in Florida, sold about 1,000 guns this way by his own admission to traffickers. They were taking them traced to murder scenes. So there's people very clearly abusing the law for this. And then the fact you have a loophole, I mean, you see other cases people who are, there's one, I talk to some of the gun traffickers and they say if somebody's really desperate, they're desperate, like the way that the guy, a gun trafficker in Baltimore interviewed, said if they're beefing, if they're desperate, like I need a gun now, I've got to get a gun, give me a gun, they're desperate, then obviously the seller immediately puts the price up. This guy's fucking desperate. I'm going to put the price up. So when you see that, there's one case of a guy who was like on the online, I need a gun, like endless emails. I want a gun now. I'll give you all the cash. Some guy goes to him, okay, I'll sell you a gun. The guy buys it, says, okay, I'll buy it private sale, no paperwork. Turns out the guy's got a history of domestic abuse, which would have banned him. He buys the gun, walks into a sauna where his ex-wife is, shoots her and like 3 other people. Like bang, 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 bang. So the fact that you can have a loophole in this law means that effectively it kind of cancels out the law. But you've got a loophole in the gun law, then then felons can find ways to buy guns quite easily.
And in a lot of these cases, those guns, like the private seller just goes to the shop, buys the guns, and like can actually sell them privately. They're not open. They've never been fired before. That was incredible. I actually didn't realize it was that the hole was that open to be able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, officially, you can be you can be charged, and the crime is, again, it's not federal firearm trafficking. It's engaging in gun selling without a license. So you're like an unlicensed seller. If they say,
so they're basically saying you're not actually a private citizen selling this, like you bought this with the intention to resell. You're sort of functioning as a seller and an unlicensed one at that.
Exactly. Gotcha. So you're actually selling. But I mean, it's worse than that because they're deliberately selling to people. I mean, people, and I mean, again, I saw somebody else in a gun show, and it was a woman, and she said, I'm looking for a certain type of gun, and he goes, oh, I've got, and he was a private seller, and he sold her a gun. He said, oh yeah, I know somebody got it, but you need ID for that. And she was like, shook her head, like basically saying, I can't buy a gun with ID. And then he went ahead and sold her a gun, and even taking like credit card payments. People have cash apps and stuff. So
aren't they technically, like in that case, like if he has reason to suspect that she's got something, he's not supposed to make that sale, right? In theory.
Yeah, exactly. So again, these are, and on when the ATF, this case in Florida, where the ATF actually went in there and pretended to be somebody buying a gun, which is what I did as well in Dallas. But the ATF did this, and they said to catch the person on tape, they said, I can't really have a gun. And this guy was like, don't kill anybody. Like, ha, ha, ha.
Jesus Christ.
Oh my gosh.
So again, I mean, this is it's getting to the business of gun trafficking. But
and my understanding too was that like when, I don't remember if it was you talking with somebody or reporting on a conversation, but like there were actually folks who were, I think, cartel straw buyers who thought that they were participating in some black market, like not recognizing that they were actually using the loophole,
Yeah, was that
which
the guy
again is just
from the
like
prison that you talked to?
Yeah, exactly. This profile, the same guy. Like when I asked him, I said, like, how do you buy it? He says, you go to the gun show, you find, he said, there's a black market at the show, a parallel black market at the show. And again, it's more complicated because they're actually using the loophole. But again, I mean, you could call it is a black market, really, and or kind of grey. So it's very interesting how this is operating, within the eye of the law, or abusing these loopholes, and people don't give very stiff sentences for it.
So
there's. Sorry, go ahead, Nomi.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, well, you just like casually mentioned straw purchase, and we haven't got into that yet because that's the like second major hole that's leading to so many guns being around. So can you explain like what is the concept of straw purchasing, and what are some of the penalties that are involved in it? Because this blew my mind finding out about this.
Yeah, so the concept of straw purchasing is I've got a clean record, or you've got a clean record. Brian Norman's got a clean record, and I've got a felony and I want a gun. So I say to Brian, go in a shop and buy me a gun. And you say, okay, and I'll give you $100 for a rifle, for an AR-15. Give you $100 and the money for the gun. You go in there, you buy it. So you bought it in your name, and then you give it to me. Now, straw purchasing is the way that federal agents talk about this, but there's no crime called straw purchasing. And again, it gets back, there's no crime called federal firearms trafficking. The crime is lying on the form. When you get the form, here's this gun for you, yes. And so you lied on the form. Now, you can, on the books, be given up to 10 years. The recommended sentencing is probation. And so you get cases, and the one case I look at in the book and document is a guy who went in Texas and he bought 10 AK-47s. So you walk in a shop and you're buying 10 of exactly the same AK-47s. I mean, again, it's kind of crazy.
It is. It's totally. It's fucking nuts.
Yeah.
Actually,
you buy 10 AK-47s for a dealer. The dealer's connected to the Zetas cartel, and he was paid $600 for that straw buy, so $60 per rifle. He was an Iraq War vet, and he was given probation, even though one of the guns was traced to the shooting dead of an American agent in Mexico. So you see those, and you see other cases. I have a case in Buffalo I looked at. I mean, a guy was, he was doing more. He was buying in his own name. He was buying in his own name and selling to gangs. He bought in one buy 85 guns. Walking the or 85 guns. So I mean, it's kind of mind blowing to look outside this. What would be the justification for anybody to buy 85 firearms? They're a regular citizen. One of the responses, and I do like in all of this stuff, I try and I engage with gun owners, I engage with gun enthusiasts. And there's some who say, yeah, I mean, I like guns, I like shooting guns, but I don't, I think there should be some basic measures. Others will say, well, it's not the government's business to know what we do with 85 guns. That's the Second Amendment. He might want to have he might want to have 85 guns. There are people with 200 firearms, but it's still, in any measure, in terms of just like from a criminal investigative point of view, somebody buying 85 guns in a single purchase has to raise suspicions about where they're going.
There's got to be some reason for that.
Yeah, unless somebody's one in Vegas and they love guns and they're like, I'm going to buy 85 guns today.
And is there any laws on the books on how many firearms you can purchase at one time?
No, I mean, so there's some, again, this kind of weird mosaic. After some of this stuff has happened, they said in some of the border states, if you do multiple buys of rifles now, not in all, only in the border states, then they should alert the ATF, just let them know, okay, this person's just came in here and bought 10 AR-15s. Guy came in and bought 20 AK-47s. That's not like a law against it. One thing, I mean, if you're looking at just basic, when the books work of investigation, not preaching, but like, I think, basic, if it's like want to uphold basic firearms laws or basically trying to stop them getting to criminals, just extended background check if somebody wants to buy a 50 caliber. These 50 cals, which fire bullets this size, and that's a big deal as well. Or the cartel, if someone wants to buy a bunch of AK-47s, just an extended background check, just give a bit of chance to find out who they are and why they're buying these guns. If people are in favor of that solution, as opposed to other other things, and there's very worthwhile debates about all of this.
Totally. Well, and I guess one of the things, because I want to go back for a moment and talk about, we've talked a lot, I guess, about like the more modern, more recent legislation, but like, and I want to make a note just to come back and talk about some of the ways that like the track and trace sort of systems are, hampered intentionally. But before we sort of continue running down the more modern stuff, there was a point you'd made a while back talking about the 1934 legislation, and if memory serves, that was tied to like the era of like the Tommy gun slingers and the sudden sort of spike in street violence around that. But something that struck me when you were talking earlier about the existence of black markets and black markets more generally is that spike was also connected in part to prohibition, to alcohol prohibition. Yeah. And so like we're talking about drugs and guns. I mean, even in the modern drug discourse, it's like it can be a stretch to get people to think about tobacco and alcohol and other drugs as drugs. We say drugs and alcohol, but looking at the way that prohibition and gun violence and these black markets of drugs and guns have sort of been intimately connected over the years. I mean, at this point, coming on 100 years, looking back to 34 almost, we've seen attempts to legislate around certain categories of firearms, which again is what you're talking about with the 50 cals. I mean, we've seen that with machine guns, right? And so can you talk about some of the dynamics in that, 34 sort of era of legislation and what was going on?
Yeah, and that's a great point actually about, it also came from prohibition gangs. That's a very good point. And another thing that came from as well was connected to motor cars or, cars, that changed criminality. Suddenly they're driving around different states and stuff. It changed the way criminals operate. Totally. So you had these early machine guns, Tommy guns, and to understand all of this, we need to get the development of automatic weaponry. So the Tommy guns were pre-World War II and pre the revolution with AK-47s, and were not considered a very accurate weapon, for a Tommy gun in a battlefield. But for these gangsters in their trilbies going into speakeasies, spraying, that they were fine. So when they saw these, they had the 1934 Act, and the interesting thing about that is they didn't outright ban machine guns, meaning fully automatic weapons. So you press your finger on the trigger and it will carry on firing bullets until the trigger comes off, as opposed to semi-automatic, you're going bang, 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 bang. They didn't fully ban them. They're still not fully banned in the United States. They introduced the machine gun tax So the machine gun tax was the complicated thing that you had to pay a bunch of money. It was expensive at those rates and get photographed. And so these gangsters didn't want to do that. And still today, then later on, they also banned the importing and importing of new machine guns and sale. So to buy a machine gun in the United States is very, very expensive. It's pre-ban models. So you look online and go pre-ban automatic rifle, and they'll be like $25,000. And they'll also be difficult you have to go through and get the machine gun tag, which is a big process. But there are people who still do it, like the Alaska Machine Gun Association.
I actually had, just as a quick note, I had a really sketchy, like 2-hour long tow truck ride in North Carolina, rural North Carolina, with a tow truck driver who went on a number of racist and anti-Semitic rants, was upset that Obama wasn't, or had gotten rid of all the coal jobs, and then proceeded to tell me about his family's unregistered, untax stamped machine guns that had been collected as like post-war items, and that made it very clear that he had no interest in giving them up, registering them, letting anyone know he had them. And it was, and I come from
Except
a family
you.
that
Some random guy he's towing.
His boss asked me how the ride was at the end, and I just kind of smiled and nodded. Like, they clearly knew something was up with the guy, but it goes back to these questions of like guns as durable goods, which we'll touch on later. But sorry, the point you were making about the Alaskan machine gun.
Absolutely. Guns as durable goods, I think, is a big another big part of the logic of guns, and the fact guns do last, and the fact you've got somebody talked about this guy who would even be some gangster in Houston who'd be even using guns from like before like 1870s, whatever, and it's like it's not even banned because the gun's so old. And the guy's like, something like drug dealers like, I've got like an antique gun, but it still works. It still can fire bullets.
He's got a blunderbuss.
Yeah. I mean, it's stuff. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there, and it's a big thing that this distinction between semi-automatic and fully automatic weapons, which is an interesting part of this history, and the fact they buy AK-47s, which are semi-automatic in the United States, take them to Mexico, make them fully automatic, and will spray hard. But the difference in some ways doesn't matter that much. And in fact, people with semi-automatic AK-47s, semi-automatic AR-15s can do huge amounts of damage if they want to. I mean, and the guy walking into the discos in Florida with semi-automatic, and they can kill, So this distinction actually is a little bit, I think, of a red herring. The whole thing of semi-automatic, fully automatic. Once they made fully automatic weaponry, that changed warfare. Once you got it in your hand, you can spray, 100 bullets in 10 seconds. That did change warfare compared to redcoats. The redcoats standing there going bang and then reloading, and the other side's going bang and reloading. Compared to what warfare used to look like back in those days.
The gentleman's war.
Well, rifling alone, right? Putting grooves in the barrel to increase accuracy.
Yeah, right. Yes, because before there's a shoving, guns in there. But once you change that, once you've got that now, modern warfare, they're not fighting in the open. So one of the tragedies, in fact, or one of the kind of tragic paradoxes, is that the AK-47 changed warfare, but nowadays in modern combat situations, mostly they're not going to be spraying because it's a waste of bullets. The enemy is hiding. You look at the way they're fighting in like Fallujah. I actually had the chance to go to the Philippines and see some of the fighting in Marawi, the Islamic State uprising there, and how that was playing out. And you see in that kind of modern warfare that they're hiding, they've got cover, they're not in the open. But if somebody walks into the Bataclan disco in Paris and they spray with fully auto AKs, they can just like mow people down.
Totally. Well, and this also, like, talking about the way sort of warfare changed with fully automatics. I mean, the same thing happened on a sort of micro scale in like Miami with the cocaine cowboys, right? Where all of a sudden the police were finding themselves outgunned. There was this influx of automatic weaponry in some cases, and the use of like motorcycle drive-bys, things like that. Where, again, thinking about what you were saying earlier about the Tommy gun in the car, I'm spacing on her name. I think the nickname was the Black Widow, right? Introducing Griselda. Yeah, bringing in the motorcycle drive-by and things like that.
Yeah.
Like,
well, in fact, Miami was the beginning of a lot of the American police forces stepping up with their weaponry. There was one famous shootout as well in Miami where some police got very heavily outgunned, and they were like, we need heavier weapons. And so then you have the whole militarization of US policing and SWAT teams and all of these things as well. And I mean, again, a lot of these guns, I mean, a lot of the move, the way guns developed between the 70s, and then by the time, the 80s, the 90s, and what, guns are like now, the semi-automatic pistols as well people have now are different from the old revolvers they used to have. You look at that scene in Taxi Driver, which I talk about the gun, I think maybe that's the most famous illegal gun selling scene in cinema, and he kind of lays them out, and this guy, that guy, and in the hotel, Easy Andy, I think the name of the guy is called, the criminal's called. He lays out these guns and stuff. Those old guns there compared to what they have now as well. But yeah, I mean that's it's changed the way that guns are used and police react to guns and so forth. But more so with the AK-47s. And it's an interesting thing as well with the dynamics of this is that in the US, most of the shootings, illegal shootings in the US, most of the shootings with illegally possessed guns in the United States, with like gangsters who are not allowed to have guns and have bought guns illegally, as opposed to somebody who is, somebody who's allowed to buy a gun. Most of them are carried out with pistols. So that is an interesting dynamic there. The shootings in Baltimore, in St. Louis, most of them are pistols. In Mexico, there's a lot of long guns used, and that does change the dynamics of this whole fighting.
I guess something we'd flagged earlier to loop back to was the sort of weapons tracing, right? So if we're talking about shootings that are taking place, and then we're talking about the ATF trying to figure out what's gone down, where the gun was purchased, how it was used. I mean, I found it totally eye-opening to discover that none of that is automated and none of that's digitized. That this is like, we're talking in the 21st century, paper records, people running it down, attempting to make sense of it. I mean, even at the point where they're getting like digital data, when they're getting hard drives, that they have to turn that into paper files.
Yeah, at one point you described
the imagery
ATF.
of the ATF offices was great. Just all those boxes and boxes
Yeah,
of
and
papers.
you said that the ATF agent, when he was explaining to you when you get a hard drive, I think you ended the paragraph saying like he explained to me the process of destroying the hard drive with a straight face.
Yeah.
This gets into the. I mean, again, it's the mosaic of this legislation. Gets down to the 86. You look at some of the clauses in the stuff, in the laws, created like after the legislation and the regulations they bring out of the laws. And it was like the government is not allowed to have a database with a search. The phrase is a searchable database of gun ownership, but people still want them to trace guns at crime scenes. So they have these two contradictory things. So what happens is in the National Trace Center, which is in West Virginia, middle of nowhere, and this huge center. What they do is you find a smoking gun. Literally, there's a murder. Somebody shoots somebody, dumps the gun at the scene, runs away. Literally, smoking gun at the crime scene. Police turn up. They've got this. We've got the smoking gun, and a lot of the cops don't even know the rules. The cops call up the trace center. We've got a smoking gun. Give us a trace. Give us an owner. And they go, we can't do that. We're not allowed. We don't have a searchable database of gun, and it's not like a car license plate. We'll simply phone it in. Bang, you've got the name. It's we're going to phone up the gun manufacturer, and so we've got the serial number. Who did that gun go to? Which distributor? Then we phone up the distributor or email them and say, who did you sell that to? And follow the chain. And the average time is 11 days to search that. Now, when you have gun stores that go out of business, because then so you can't keep the gun records of the active gun store there. You've got to just, they're owned by the gun owner, so the gun store owner, gun store. But when a gun store goes out of business, then they, otherwise all those records would be dead. So then they give their records to the gun tracing center. But then at that point, if they're given to them on a hard drive, it's like we're not allowed to have searchable data because we have to print it all out and then destroy the hard drive. Then they found weird ways around it of saying, well, because they would actually have microfilms there of somewhere. And they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take photographs of all of these different gun records and then put them onto a computer, but it's not searchable. So they're still just going through, but it's a big pile of paper. So it's kind of a crazy system, and it's kind of weirdness again.
Are there countries that do have searchable gun databases, and is their turnaround time way quicker than ours?
Yeah, sure. I mean, most countries we're going to have, most countries will have searchable databases of gun records.
Mm-hmm.
There's no comparison though between European countries.
Mm-hmm.
The level of gun murders is so much lower than the United States. And then Latin American countries, the level of gun deaths is higher than the United States per capita. And then law enforcement here is a whole different level of fucked. So there's no real comparison. I think, if there's a gun murder in the UK, it's likely carried out with a legal gun. But if there's a gun, if they find a gun in the UK, they're very accounted for.
Gotcha.
They know who the guns are. They're going to, if they find a gun with the serial number, they're going to check it, and if they're going to get them right away. But it's not that many licensed gun owners going around with guns shooting people.
Yeah. Well, and on that note too, there's a lot less licensed gun sellers in other places too, right? Like you talk about how in Mexico there's really only one, and it's through the government.
Yeah. So you've got this one. So in Mexico, there is a right to bear arms in Mexico. But it's not an easy right to exercise. Which gun enthusiast, Second Amendment enthusiast would then say, well, that's not really a right. Then, but you go to the government military-run gun shop. Going in there, it's in a secure installation in the Mexican Secretary of Defense. You go through metal detectors, hand in your cell phone. Go through. You can see guns for sale there. You have to hand in 7 pieces of paperwork, including a letter from your employer, including a clean criminal record, wait several months, get it approved, get your gun, and then you are on a gun registry. So yeah, Mexico's got fairly active gun things there, but then it's got a huge amount of illegal weapons.
Mm-hmm. And we can contrast that in the United States, where their licensed firearms sellers, the ratio of U.S. licensed firearms sellers to McDonald's is about 10-1 in the United States, which I found crazy. Crazy.
One of the best stats. I mean, a lot of crazy stats there. That's one of the best stats, isn't it? Particularly the border states. Huge amounts. The thing is, what about the industry of selling firearms is curious. One thing is that the gun culture in the United States is so massive and quite unique. There are a lot of there's a huge amount of hobbyists who just really, really love guns. And on that side, they're not that different. I think in the UK, we're a nation of a lot of hobbyists in the UK. I had friends who were obsessed with records, just totally obsessed by records. I've had a friend who was obsessed with Lego, who had slept under this huge amounts of Lego he had in his bedroom, even when he was an adult, and we have, in some ways the same, really obsessed, really hardcore hobbyists, but it's combined also with the idea of self-defense and the feeling of security of self-defense. Of people saying, I've got, one guy talked to the head of the AR-15 owners of America. He says he has an AR-15 in every room in his house, and his wife and children are taught to shoot. So that if anyone breaks into the house, any home invasion, there's always going to be an AR-15 within a couple of, you got them right away, bang, get out, bang, bang, bang. Is the idea, so the feeling of self-defense. Now, I think that is a bit of an illusion in the sense that, for various things. I mean, really, when it comes down, I think this is quite a central theme of the book. When you comes down, I don't totally write this off. There are certainly circumstances where people have defended themselves with guns. I'm not against people's right to have guns to defend themselves. What I mean is, if you compare Mexico, Honduras, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela to the United States, the difference really there is not a bunch of people with guns. It's a government and federal agencies and police forces that have hammered organized crime and not let them develop into these kind of gangster warlords that you see south of the border. So, if you did in the United States, and there's a lot of paradoxes in this. The United States is the biggest drug market in the world by far, the biggest firearms, and huge amount of illegal firearms, and it's got these very aggressive federal agencies and 2 million people in prison. And if you shoot a cop in the United States, you're probably going to go to jail. If you shoot a cop in Mexico, you're probably down the cantina having a couple of tequilas. Nothing's happened. I mean, these guys get away with killing police left, right, and center. So a lot of differences here. So really in Mexico, I mean, I'm here in Mexico City. It's a bit of a different situation. Let's say on a lot of parts of Mexico, you could be sitting in your house, you might have a gun, but then if 15, 20 guys with AR-15s with AK-47s come, you can't do much about it unless you organize into a militia, into a self-defense force. Then that gets into a whole different thing. Then you start to get into like alternative defense and kind of stuff, which is what some people in Mexico have done. They've created, self-defense militias. But yeah, it's an interesting issue about the dynamics of violence and crime and guns and really how these play out.
Well, and at the point where you're talking about militias, you're talking about controlling territory. You're talking about the notion of potentially having to clear out neighborhoods to create buffer zones as you get into some of those turf squabbles or turf wars in some cases. And something that struck me about what you had just said about the sort of false sense of security or the illusion of security of having an AR in every room. It highlights two things for me. I mean, one, so I was actually I experienced an armed home invasion from like five guys when I was a university student, and there was a sawn-off shotgun, there were some pistols, and I had airsoft rifles in the house that, one of them saw this little like Uzi thing and thought it was, immediately like grabbed it to like clear it to make sure it was fine. One of the things that really struck me after the incident was that like, had I had a weapon or had I attempted to like defend myself, the only conceivable outcome would have been some sort of shootout, right? And admittedly, like at the end, there was a moment where one of them asked, do we need to tighten anyone up? And I was like, oh shit, I'm dead. This is the end of this, all for, a couple $100 and a laptop that they got out of my house. And just having that moment afterwards when everything was okay and realizing that like, as somebody whose grandfather, took me shooting as a kid, like I grew up not around guns, but certainly not unfamiliar with them. And yet in that moment, it was the first time that I had really encountered guns, like in the sense of as a tool, where like that slang of tool suddenly like rung home, right? Opening the door and having that grimy shotgun, in my chest, stomach, whatever, and realizing like, oh, this is what this is being used for. Coming away from that at the end of it, there wasn't a sense of like, I could have made this better by escalating, like there wouldn't have been a chance to deploy. And I understand that, different situations will be different, but I think that narrative of, this will create self-defense, there's a lot to question about that. And similarly, like this notion of assault rifles or offensive rifles versus defensive weapons, or like looking at some of the narratives around, let's say, in American gun culture around rifles, modern rifles, and not only this question of is assault rifle a meaningful distinction or term, but also the way that it gets used to sort of politicize an issue and I think distract from some of the realities. You were talking earlier about the mechanics of, say, weaponry changing post machine gun, and whether the way these things can be turned into fully automatics, or the horrifying story you shared of the American military testing out the M16 early on. Could you tell us a little bit about that
Gosh,
and
yeah.
get into some of these?
I had no idea you could buy the things they were using.
Sure. So I mean, again, there's so many weird stories in the story of guns. So the getting back to the assault rifle. So the Germans in World War II create a rifle they called the Sturmgewehr.
Those are the Nazi Germans, right? Those Germans.
Nazi-run Germany. They invent the Sturmgewehr, which means storm rifle. So that's the first kind of use of assault rifle, storm rifle, Sturmgewehr, which is more effective. I mean, you've had the automatic weapons since going back to the United States, and all the way back to the Gatling gun, all this kind of stuff. But like the Sturmgewehr is kind of more effective than Tommy gun, handheld machine gun. Luckily for the Allies, that they invent that fairly late in the war, doesn't really get out too much, but some of them are captured by Soviet soldiers. Later, so 2 years after the war, the Soviets come up with the AK-47 by Kalashnikov, who died recently, and there's a personality in all this, Kalashnikov. And the AK-47 becomes the weapon that revolutionizes warfare, the most common gun in the world. This is more than 100 million AK-47s and variants around the world. A kind of genius in its simplicity. The Mexican cartels love them, loved them for many, many years. It's so simple it can be used by children, and indeed does get used by children. You go up to the mountains of Mexico and you see, kids standing around these opium crops with AK-47s. Very simple, clean out. Just keeps on running. Gets full of dust, gets full of water, keeps on banging away. So the AK-47 is revolutionizing warfare, and the Americans are like, damn, how come the Soviets have got a better gun than us? This is something wrong here. So you go to Hollywood and you have Eugene Stoner, like a fitting name, Eugene Stoner, who's in a workshop in Hollywood, of all places. I went to the workshop they first invented this, and now it's like a pet hospital. And it's next to near a gay bars and marijuana dispensaries, and it's today what Hollywood is. But back then, they were trying to make an ultimate infantry rifle for the United States. They came up with this, so Armalite rifle. Now that was then given to the U.S. military. They started testing it. So they tested this gun. And they wanted to do these tests done comparing at that point the AR-15 to a fully automatic version of the AR-15 to the AK-47. And first they got a bunch of live goats, and they just sat there blasting these live goats with these guns. But they wanted to test it on humans. So they said, well, we need some human heads to blow apart with these guns. So they couldn't find any human heads to blow apart from the United States. So they imported some from India. And by the time they'd import all these human heads over, they'd lost a bit of their consistency. So they put this weird jelly into them. And they sat there blasting these Indian human heads with these guns, and concluded that the AR-15s, which would become the M16s, were blowing them into more pieces. And that became the M16, the military machine gun 16, military rifle 16, for the US. And then they marketed the AR-15 civilian version, AR-15 sporting rifle, semi-automatic.
Yeah, there was an ad from Colt that you read about in 1963 that said, "With the Colt's new AR-15 Sporter, you're ready for a new hunting adventure." And so basically just to clarify, because I think a lot of people don't know this, the military version is the M16, and that's fully automatic.
Yeah.
And the sports version is the AR-15, that's just semi-automatic.
Absolutely.
Essentially the same thing.
Yeah, they're the same gun, apart from the semi-automatic. And I mean, the other. And the thing as well is that in the license, the patent, or there's various patents, I think, on different components, but basically the patent ran out. And then everyone started making AR-15 variants, and now you've got loads of companies. It becomes AR-15 becomes a style of gun that loads of people make. The AK-47 the Soviets are instructing factories in client states like Romania, the Kuzir factory I went to make AK-47s, but then also you get a bunch of countries making knockoffs of AK-47s, like in Yugoslavia.
Is and that's like the Wassers, the Wasser
Yeah,
10s?
yes, the Wasser 10s are the Romanian ones. So they were toured and given licenses. And then you get these like you get these artisan AK-47s they make in like Pakistan tribal areas, which are these like they bang them up, at nothing. They bang up this kind of AK-47 style rifles.
And then there's also like the Draco, which is a small like a compact, and it's a one-handed version basically.
Well, you can fire one hand. So basically the Draco, which in the book, that was used in this particular murder, so I traced it back. I found the guy who designed the Draco gun, who's this Romanian guy at the factory. He says it's the smallest AK-47 in the world. So it's kind of like an AK. It's classified as a pistol. So they sell it as it's basically the AK-47 with sawn off the barrel. So it's kind of pistol. And he says you've got like guys on YouTube. So I've got two. I'm firing one in each hand. Oh my God. But it's a very effective lethal weapon. It's a small thing. You can a compact thing, and it's a kind of an AK-47 pistol, basically.
So your time, like you wrote really a few really interesting things about the experience you had at it's Kuzir factory.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So like first of all, like when you covered the sort of European gun manufacturers and you talked about how, I guess, looking at the post-Soviet experience of or really the, I guess, Soviet and then post-Soviet experience of manufacturing the AKs and sort of how locked down it was initially. The whole town you described as sort of being heavily regimented, sort of people weren't coming in or going out who weren't monitored, I guess, to some degree. And then looking at where things are now, it was just such an interesting comparison with the US. I mean, and even comparing, say, Heckler and Koch in Germany, and the fact that you had a really interesting case of essentially like anti-war activists bringing effective lawsuits against this fairly large corporation. And I want to talk about a little bit of that. But first, there was this point at the Kuzir factory where you comment on the sort of alienation and the disconnect between this gun that you'd tracked down that had been used in a murder sort of on the other side of the world. And you had this person who was involved in the manufacture of it. And that disconnect, to me, it struck me, and I don't know if it was intended like this, but it was almost like this Marxist analysis of like how alienated, it's not just that like people are alienated from their labor or their social relations, but even in this incredible violence, there's still, global capitalism creates this alienation around this weapon that was manufactured in one place, shipped to another, and used to kill in a third.
Yeah, I mean, well, with the AK-47 as well, I mean, you've got very interesting dynamics of the Soviet weapon of war and the American capitalism. It gets, created within the Soviet system for them to carry out permanent revolution, as opposed to, in a very, in a very brutal, I don't want to.
Yeah.
I mean, Romania, pretty horror stories about what communism was like in Romania, and the first wave of repressive violence in Romania was really hard. And then it was basically a kind of spy state, and it was where people would inform on their neighbors for having chocolate. I saw my neighbor had some chocolate, telling them to the secret police stuff. But it is very, very interesting how this kind of whole thing plays out in the Soviet bit of war and the factory there. So you had I looked in one point at some American CIA reports about the Kuzir factory when they're like, in Romania, we know that they were obviously the CIA were interested in locating where Soviet weapons factories were, because it was part of their infrastructure. So when you look at like the big European gun manufacturers, and Europe's huge in manufacturing guns, they're often in these quite far away places. I mean, Kuzir's middle of Transylvania in the mountains, a small town. The Heckler and Koch factories up there in the mountains, the Black Forest. They're not right bang there. So there's like for strategic purposes, or the idea of
out of sight, out of mind a little bit.
Yeah, outside, out of mind. So then you get these factory towns with a massive loyalty to the factory because everybody's working there. Everybody's got family works there. So in the town in Cougere, people, they like the gun factory. The idea of alienation, I think, or of, it was interesting to talk to this guy who worked all his life in the gun factory and hadn't really, he had quite a good life. He actually said that during communist times, his experience of going to the gun factory, coming back, and everything was fairly relaxed. Was okay, and he didn't have a sense. It's this difference between you and the product. I think it's a very interesting thing about the kind of global networks we live in, and how we are disconnected from so many things. We are the kind of cogs in the machine, and I think that is an interesting part. I mean, the alienation concept, I think, is one of probably the points of Marx, which is maybe a bit more, that can be more rescued in a different, outside of a Marxist sense.
Sure.
I think there is a sense, part of our sense of life and part of our of the despondence and the depression, which gets into the drug use in modern ages, is that we're kind of so alienated, I think, from processes, even from our food chains and all of these different chains. But when then going to the Heckler and Koch factory in Germany, so there was this peace activist. It was a very interesting, I thought it was a very interesting personal story. This school teacher who was just a peace activist against it. But also in the town, there was this reverend who was also against the factory and was kind of like the outsider in the town, because everybody in the town was like in favor of the factory. So he was against it, and it's like, everyone, it made him very much a kind of an oddball and a difficult kind of unlikable person in that town.
Can you talk about? Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was just going to say, just trying to imagine that sort of thing taking place in the US. It's like, and you talk about the way that some of these companies, the gun manufacturers it's not hugely profitable. They're always, not always, but many of them are struggling a few steps away from bankruptcy. But even still, at least conceptually for me, trying to imagine, a school teacher in the US taking on, AR or whatever, and saying, we're going to, or Armalite, sorry, and saying, hey, we're going to, try to bring a suit against you. I mean, even looking the way that it played out in the Chapo trial, where it's almost like, no, let's not get into the guns, especially because of the questions of Fast and Furious.
Because
and the rest
of Fast
of it,
and Furious, which we totally need to get into, but I was going to try to connect the kind of Kujia factory and a little bit of the international stuff there. But can you talk about, so the Bush administration tried to pass, Daddy Bush tried to pass a ban on imports. To some extent, there was supposed to be a ban, and you write about how it wasn't a ban. Can you talk a little bit about that, but also just the concept of it's not just the guns that are being found in Mexico and in the United States, and we can get into, I believe the El Paso shooter was I think a Wasser 10 from Kujir, and also I think in the case of, which we'll get into this, but the Bortac agent Brian Terry and Jaime Zapata with ICE, I think those were also Wasser 10s that came in from Kujir. But before we get into that, and before we get into Fast and Furious, which you dedicate a lot of the book to, a book about, can you just kind of talk about the Bush quote unquote ban and just the concept of how are guns being imported into U.S. markets and and how do they get into Mexico and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you had this mass shooting in California, which used a Chinese semi-automatic AK-47 in the late 80s. And you then had Daddy Bush, as you call him. So Daddy Bush ruled 88 till 92. I think the shooting was 89. And then he said, okay, we're going to have a ban on importing assault rifles. Now, one of the issues with all of these assault rifle legislation is, what's the definition of an assault rifle? So what they did is they say, okay, we're going to say it's got a couple more of certain features, like an assault rifle's got these kind of hand grips and these kind of, and it's semi. So like what they did was then they have these certain features, but you then find that people can get around this by changing a few features on the guns, and they import it as a sporting rifle. The second way they can get around it is it's an import on foreign guns, but there's a certain number of parts, if they're made in the USA, could just be added to the gun, and it's made in USA guns. So you can bring in slightly unfinished guns, put in a couple of parts, and then you make them. So basically, very easy to kit around this kind of stuff.
One of the interesting things that I find about sort of the Daddy Bush assault rifle ban and the questions around that, for me, I remember as a kid, my grandfather taking me to shoot and commenting on some of the, I think at the time he was commenting on the absurdity of like outlawing a banana clip or whatever, and the sort of cosmetic and aesthetic components of that. And then years later, when I was helping to disperse his estate after he passed, I actually came across a letter that he'd written to his state legislators in Florida, specifically dealing with the absurdity of trying to address gun violence through these aesthetic measures, and commenting on the lack of willingness for people to engage with the systemic drivers of gun violence, the lack of social safety nets, the sort of rampant issues with broader structural failings of American society. And then coming across the way, when you then went on to present that the import legislation has just as many holes around, you can slap a few more parts on it and suddenly it's made in the US. I mean, it seems like whether we're talking about assault rifle bans or import bans or so-called gun show loopholes, it's like the way that the laws have been crafted aren't, it's such that there are so many holes. I mean, it's basically Swiss cheese.
I think with the solutions, kind of getting to the policy ideas broadly on this on this stuff. I don't pretend that there's like really simple solutions to a lot of these complex issues. And I'd say, first of all, it's a book about investigation and trying to make a bit more sense about what's happening. But I think there are some of the things we can conclude. On one of them, there is attempts to reduce the firearms in the hands of criminals that vary massively from some countries to others. So we can see the case of Europe and the way that the firearms have been reduced in the hands of criminals compared to the United States. With the issue, I think, of the central issue of firearms trafficking to Mexico, I think what I would say is that the kind of low-hanging fruit have not even been taken. That right now, there's not even a kind of sensible attempt to try and stop any of the firearms trafficking. Even the basic stuff of people blatantly working with criminal gangs, supplying them with huge amounts of weaponry. There's not even the basic kind of efforts to stop that. So kind of even the kind of basic ideas of enforcement haven't been really exercised in that. And the fact that, you've got this conflict in Mexico with, a hybrid crime war. And the fact is that the United States is the major supplier of weapons into that conflict. And there haven't even been a basic attempt to try and reduce that flow of guns to this conflict where we've seen so much death.
Totally.
All right. So we're going to wrap part 1 here. And so I want to give you the opportunity, Yoan, to do a little pluggables here. First, I want to plug your books, though. Your book's El Narco, and the next book is Gangster Warlords, and your current book is Blood, Gun, Money. And I would just want to tell listeners, because, we exist in like the drug policy reform kind of psychedelic space. And your books have been massively informative for me to wrap my mind around just the concept of the drug war, really. And I want to get into this in the second part, so listen to the second part about this. But one of the reasons I want to, when you went onto Joe Rogan, and we were talking about that, like a lot of people, when they talk about drug policy or drugs in the United States, they really don't know what's going on the ground in the drug producing countries. And it's really like this US centric focus. And, you've done such a great job in these books at really just the people. You're on the ground. It's gritty. It's super gritty. At the beginning of this episode, you talked about sort of not like an anthropological, academic view. It's a street view, and it really is. So yeah, I'm rambling. If you want to plug anything, go ahead.
I mean, yeah, great to be here. Thanks so much. Great to talk to you and be in touch again and know your listeners, all your followers. You can see me. I've got a weird name, so I'm kind of easy to find. Search for Ioan Grillo. My website is www.yoangrillo.com. You can see me on Twitter at Ioan Grillo. A couple of YouTube's video as well. You can search for Ioan Grillo. So yeah, easy to find, and yeah, all support's appreciated.
All right. Thank you so much for being here.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for that.
a lot.
Thanks so much there.